It was a pleasant Tuesday afternoon in the drawing room of Miss Marple's modest but cozy cottage in St. Mary Mead. A gentle breeze stirred the lace curtains, and the vicar's wife had just excused herself after a spirited discussion about local theatrics. That was when Miss Jane Marple, knitting needles in hand, began to recount a curious case that had once baffled even the more hardened minds of Scotland Yard. "It all began," said Miss Marple with a twinkle in her eye, "at the summer residence of a certain film star, a Miss Margot Bevan, who had leased a bungalow in Devon for a private creative retreat. Margot Bevan was a darling of British cinema, dazzling, dramatic, and dreadfully good at drawing attention. When she invited a small circle of acquaintances to her secluded bungalow, tongues in the industry wagged. But it wasn't gossip that later made headlines. It was a heist. One morning, Margot emerged in a flurry of tears and silk dressing gowns to declare she'd been robbed. Her prized necklace, a Cartier stunner reportedly worth £40,000, had vanished from her locked bedroom. The French doors had been flung open, the velvet jewelry box lay empty on the vanity, and a window pane had been delicately cut. A classic jewel theft, it seemed, but something didn't sit quite right. The local police were baffled. No footprints, no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry beyond the artfully sliced glass. The newspapers dubbed it the affair at the bungalow and speculated everything from an obsessive fan to an inside job. That was when Sir Henry Clithering, a retired commissioner and acquaintance of Miss Marple, brought the matter to her attention over tea. "She wants attention," Miss Marple had said at once, sipping from a rose-patterned teacup. "That's quite clear. But is she willing to part with her own jewels to get it? Or are they not quite hers at all?" Traveling under the guise of a friend of the Clithering family, Miss Marple paid a polite visit to the bungalow. The starlet, pale and fragile in her silks, bemoaned the emotional trauma of a burglary. But Miss Marple noticed several odd details. The glass cutter used to breach the window had not pierced all the way through. The velvet jewelry box bore no indentation where such a heavy necklace should have rested. And most telling of all, the actress kept referring to the missing item as a Cartier, but no one had ever seen her wear it. Later that week, a local jeweler discreetly contacted the police. A woman, heavily veiled and using an alias, had tried to pawn a paste replica of the necklace. Not only was it nearly worthless, but it had a tiny inscription etched inside the clasp: "Property of Margot Bevan, Prop Department." It was Miss Marple who put the final pieces together. She never lost the real necklace, she explained, because she never owned it. The theft was fabricated to gain publicity before her upcoming film premiere. She planted a fake necklace and staged a theatrical crime scene. It's quite like that pantomime my niece was in, Cinders and the Jewel Thief, all very dramatic and ultimately hollow. Under quiet pressure, Margot confessed. The necklace had been a prop from her last film, never real to begin with. The entire heist was a publicity stunt gone slightly awry when it attracted real police investigation. Margot's star dimmed shortly afterward, not due to scandal, but because the public had grown weary of spectacle. As Miss Marple would later say, while tidying her knitting basket, "People always forget that truth, like cream, rises to the top, and fraud, like foam, eventually evaporates." Miss Marple, of course, never sought glory from her little deductions, though Scotland Yard quietly admitted her help had been invaluable once again. The affair was hushed in the press after Margot's studio scrambled to settle matters. They spun it as a misunderstanding over a misidentified prop, but everyone in the know understood the truth. However, the matter wasn't quite over. About a fortnight later, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. A young woman, no more than 23, stood at her garden gate, twisting the strap of her handbag nervously. She had sharp eyes, a modest hat, and introduced herself as Lillian Vale, a costume assistant who had once worked on Margot's last film. Miss Marple, ever gracious, invited her in for tea and scones. "I didn't know who else to speak to," Lillian confessed, voice barely above a whisper. "But I overheard Miss Bevan on the phone before the heist. She was furious someone had found out the necklace was fake. She said, 'If he talks, I'll be ruined.'" Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. "He," Lillian nodded, "a man named Adrian Sloane. He was her accountant, and possibly much more. But he disappeared just days after the so-called burglary. No one's seen him since. That night, Miss Marple sat in her armchair, eyes narrowed. Something deeper had been missed. With the discreet assistance of Sir Henry Clithering, a quiet investigation into Adrian Sloane's whereabouts began. A few inquiries led them to a rental cottage just outside Torquay, leased under a false name. Inside, they found documents, bank statements, and photographs, including one damning image. Margot Bevan slipping a velvet case into her handbag 2 days before she reported it stolen. But what truly caught Miss Marple's attention was a ledger. It revealed payments from Margot to a private investigator, one who'd been following another actress named Vivian Grey, her rising rival in the studio. She didn't just fake a theft for attention, Miss Marple said one evening to Sir Henry, as they reviewed the evidence. She did it to bury a scandal, one she feared Vivian would expose. Vivian Grey, it turned out, had once shared a flat with Margot in their struggling theater days. Back then, Margot had lifted more than just costume jewelry. She had taken Vivian's script, passed it off as her own idea, and parlayed it into the very role that made her a star. Sloane had discovered this. He'd warned Margot that Vivian had begun speaking to a tabloid reporter, and threatened to expose both the script theft and financial fraud Margot had used to bankroll her early career. The fake jewel heist was a smoke screen, meant to buy time, divert the media, and discredit anyone who tried to connect her to earlier crimes. Unfortunately for her, Miss Marple was never distracted by glitter. Margot Bevan's fall from grace was swift once the full truth emerged. Her studio quietly severed ties. Vivian Grey received a modest settlement, and soon after debuted her own film, based on the very play Margot had once stolen. As for Miss Marple, she returned to St. Mary Mead, where the roses bloomed and the gossip at the church bazaar resumed its usual rhythm. "I always say," she told her friend Dolly Bantry a few days later, "that the clever ones do too much. All it takes is a little inconsistency, a window too carefully broken, a jewel box too light, and the whole performance begins to unravel." She glanced down at her latest knitting project, a scarf with a delicate diamond pattern. "Even the best actors," she said with a smile, "can't fool an old lady with good eyesight. The true jewel wasn't stolen. It was never real to begin with. But truth, Miss Marple believed, always sparkled under scrutiny." Months passed. The summer scandal became yesterday's news, buried under fresher headlines and newer faces in the film world. Margot Bevan left the country under the guise of creative retreat, though those in the know whisper about blacklisted contracts and shuttered doors. Vivian Grey's play, The Ashes of Fame, opened to glowing reviews in the West End, her name now synonymous with quiet brilliance and poetic justice. When asked in an interview if the play was inspired by anyone real, she simply smiled and said, "Let's just say, the truth has a way of writing itself." As for Miss Marple, she sat one golden autumn afternoon in her garden, sipping tea and trimming the fading blooms. Her niece Raymond's wife had sent a book of new detective stories, but Miss Marple found most of them terribly unrealistic. "A jewel heist with no motive is as hollow as a box with no ring," she murmured to herself. "And actresses are best left to the stage. Real drama, I find, happens in parlors, not premieres." A knock came at the garden gate. The vicar's wife, breathless and curious, had heard rumors about Margot's exile and Vivian's triumph. "But however did you know Jane?" she asked, eyes wide as saucers. Miss Marple just smiled, eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "My dear," she said, rising with her usual prim grace, "the moment someone insists on being watched, you must ask yourself why. True victims don't rehearse their grief. And diamonds, real or not, don't vanish unless someone needs them to." She paused, plucked the last rose of the season, and added gently, "The cleverest lies are often hidden in plain sight, but so, too, is the truth." She returned to her chair, picked up her knitting, and began the next row. Life in St. Mary Mead resumed its quiet hum, while far beyond the hedgerows and flower beds, the stage lights dimmed on yet another act of deception.